Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, Xi Jinping calls for solid measures to modernize agriculture in rural areas. A decade after Brexit vote, majority of Britons say leaving the European Union was a mistake. And we're going to talk to an official with the Australian Embassy in Beijing about Australia-China agricultural cooperation. The World Health Organization says Ebola cases in DR Congo reached the highest first-month total of any outbreak. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on our previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. First up, Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for advancing the modernization of agriculture in rural areas. He made remarks during an inspection tour to the city of Dezhou in the eastern Chinese province of Shandong. Xi Jinping emphasized that ensuring a stable supply of grain and other major agricultural products remains a top priority. He called for stronger support for grain production, wider use of advanced farming technologies, and a continued improvements in terms of the agricultural infrastructure. The Chinese leader have also stressed building a livable and prosperous rural communities, urging the local officials to deliver tangible benefits to the people and help local farmers create better lives through hard work and innovation. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Wang Xingsong, Associate Professor joining us from the School of Government, Beijing Normal University. So thank you very much for joining us, Professor Wang Xingsong.
Thank you for having me.
The focus of President Xi Jinping's inspection tour to Dezhou is to get to know the local situation surrounding, say, harvest and planting for the summer season. Why is this a key timing for ensuring China's food security throughout the whole year? And what role does the province of Shandong play in China's overall picture regarding food security?
Well, the timing is very important because in northern China, this is the season when winter wheat is harvested, and the next crop, often corns, is planted. So it's about whether the farming calendar can move smoothly from one planting season to the next. And then wheat accounts for roughly 40% of China's annual grain output. So that means summer harvest of wheat is very important to China's food security. And if there are problems at this stage because of potentially bad weather or weak planting or machinery shortages and so forth, then there's going to be pressure, right? And that's going to carry into the autumn harvest season and the rest of the year. And this is why President Xi Jinping's visit to Dezhou to look at the wheat harvesting and corn planting is very important, both symbolically and practically. And Shandong obviously is a very important province in China's food security system. It's a major agricultural province. It also has very strong grain production, vegetable production, and other agricultural specialties. And Dezhou itself is also a very important part of China's grain producing belt. So in China's food security system, places like Shandong are both production bases and they're also stabilizers of China's grain supply and food security.
In terms of agricultural modernization, we know the comprehensive mechanization rate in China's agricultural sector had reached more than 76% as of last year, an increase from slightly over 60% back in the year 2014. What do you think this rate tells us?
Well, this tells us that China's agriculture has obviously moved into a much more modern stage with much higher mechanization rate than before. So that means that key farming processes such as harvesting, field management, and plowing, and so forth, are now supported by machinery rather than relying on manual labor. And especially in wheat harvesting, mechanization now is about 97%. And then for corn and rice harvesting, mechanization rates are slightly lower, like 90% and 86% respectively. And this is very important because mechanization helps stabilizes food production and food security. When the harvest season is short, timing is very, very important. And machines can harvest much faster than human labor. And mechanization also addresses the rural labor problems. Obviously, we have a very large population of migration in China from rural to urban places. So without machinery, it means that it's going to be very difficult to maintain large-scale grain production and harvesting because of shortage of the rural labor force. And then modernization in agriculture is also about productivity. Now you have a smaller number of people living in rural areas, but then you still can increase agricultural productivity with modernization of technologies. At the same time, we got to realize that mechanization is still uneven across regions. Obviously, in Shandong, we have seen very high mechanization rate, but in hinterland, especially in mountain areas, large-scale mechanization is still having challenges because of special types of terrains.
Yeah, indeed. So we noticed the Chinese leader calling for wider use of advanced farming technologies and continued improvements in agricultural infrastructure. And like you said, some regions in China, especially some mountainous regions like terraces, they are traditionally viewed as unfit for agricultural mechanization. How do you think some of the new emerging technologies, for example, drones, are nowadays changing that old picture?
Right. I think you rightly pointed out that mountain areas are difficult for application of large scale mechanization, like the machines we use in places like Henan, Shandong province, because obviously the hilly areas, have fragmented land and slopes, narrow roads, and et cetera, which makes it really hard to use large machines. But we have observed that emerging technologies are changing that picture. And one change is we have seen smaller, lighter, and more specialized machineries. And these are very helpful in hilly and mountainous areas. So we're talking about like compact harvesters, small tractors, orchard machinery, tea picking and cherry picking machines, and all these emerging devices and equipments are helping out the rural laborers in those mountain and hilly areas. And then another change is we have seen more smart and unmanned equipment such as drones. Right? China now has a very large scale use of agriculture drones. We're talking about 300,000 drones being used in agriculture production in 2025. And these really are important because they don't care about whether this is flat field or not.
Yeah.
Because drones can, spray, can monitor crop growth, can map farmland, and so on and so forth, and they're really helpful. And then you have the digital agriculture, right? And you have sensors, satellite positioning, and weather data, and all these technologies are helping farmers to make better decisions about farming, like irrigation, fertilization, pest control, and so forth. And this is also important, especially in mountainous regions, because over there, the microclimates vary very much from village to village. So you need those sensors and satellite images to tell you a better picture of what to do in terms of farming.
So, what do you make of the role of agricultural modernization in China's rural revitalization strategy? And by the way, can modernization of the agricultural sector alone fulfill this bigger mission to revitalize China's rural areas to bring prosperity, greater prosperity to rural residents?
Well, agricultural modernization obviously is very necessary for rural vitalization because in China, agriculture still remains a very important economic base in the rural communities, right? So if farming is related to low income, low productivity, and is vulnerable to disasters like weather shocks, this is going to be very difficult for rural areas to keep the people, attract investments, or improve public services. So modern agriculture can help out, can raise productivity, can reduce losses, and improve product quality, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, agricultural modernization really turns agriculture into a more market-oriented, technology-supported industry. But with that said, agricultural modernization alone cannot fulfill the whole mission of rural vitalization because rural vitalization is much broader, right? It doesn't only include productivity and planting and income, it also includes industrial development, talent, ecology, and public services, right? And so if, for example, young people, migrants in urban areas, they're now determined to go back to their homeland, their rural hometowns to find new job opportunities. Then in rural areas, you got to have such industries available, economy that can provide job opportunities and the fiscal conditions that can provide public services. So all these are a coherent, a holistic system of rural vitalization where agricultural modernization is only a part of.
So, Dr. Wang, in a bigger picture sense, why do you think China's top leadership attach so much great importance to agricultural and rural affairs? What do you think this tells us about China's governance mentality?
This is because agriculture is not just a economic sector, right? It's connected to, we discussed, food security. It's connected to social stability, rural livelihoods, and even national security. And in China, the specific national condition is that we have a large population. At the same time, we have very limited arable land. So per capita arable land in China is only 1/4 of the world's average. And at the same time, we're faced with increasing global shocks like wars and sanctions and also climate changes, right? So all of that makes dependence on global market very unsustainable because after all, you cannot solely depend on food import, right? You got to keep the grain supply in your own hands. Another reason is social stability. Hundreds of millions of Chinese people still live in rural areas. And many migrant workers are still hoping to return to their home villages. So if rural areas decline too sharply, then we're going to have a social stability problem. And another thing is really about the concept of modernization, which is not just about urbanization, advanced technology, and manufacturing. It's also about inclusiveness, right? Rural areas cannot be left behind. Modernization is only complete with everyone included. So overall, I think this reflects the style of China's leadership thinking, which is about bottom lines, long-term planning, and systemic risk management. And so food security is a bottom line, rural stability is a bottom line, and farmland protection is also a bottom line. And the leadership does not just want short-term market efficiency or growth. It wants the long-term livelihoods, prosperity, and national security.
Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Wang Xingsong, Associate Professor joining us from the School of Government with Beijing Normal University. You're listening to World Today. Stay tuned. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. A recent independent survey shows that a majority of Britons now believe that leaving the European Union was a mistake for their own country. Only 30% of the people polled by this YouGov organization polling said they still believe that Britain was right to leave. Tuesday this week marked the 10th anniversary of the Brexit public referendum in 2016. Britain has been mired in political turmoil since the vote. Over the past decade, 6 prime ministers have struggled to deal with the fallout that has been further compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the Ukraine war and the Middle East wars. An analysis of the government data shows that Britain's economy took a 6% hit as a result of the Brexit. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Mike Bastian, joining us from the University of Southampton. Thank you very much for joining us, Mike.
Hello.
A decade ago, the current mayor of the city of London, Mr. Sadiq Khan, he campaigned at the time to remain within the EU ahead of the referendum. And recently he said that, quote, the consequences 10 years on are worse than what we feared, unquote. So, Mike, do you concur with him? Why or why not?
I think certainly it's difficult to compare because the consequences and the predictions were quite dramatic at the time and weren't taken very seriously because this was a unique thing. It wasn't expected. I think Sadiq Khan is also referring to social as well as economic consequences, probably more on the social side being mayor of the City of London. But I broadly concur that the picture is largely negative and in many cases is worse than we feared. Yes, we have to break down the impact according to the economy, aspects of the economy, but yes, it's not a very, very rosy picture at all 10 years on.
So in terms of the economic angle, in what ways do you think the Brexit has affected Britain's economy?
Well, I think clearly coming out of a single European market with trade, most people would have accepted our trade with the EU was easily 40%, closer to 50% of our overall trade base, disadvantaged many companies, lots of red tape, lots of paperwork, lots of delays. And the consensus amongst most economists is that the impact has been negative, a drag on the UK economy, reduction of GDP, as you said, by 6%, some would say 8%. So negative business investment is down. So the National Institute of Economic and Social Research have concluded that business investment is down by 12 to 13% as a direct result of Brexit. UK trade with Europe, which was on an upward trend before the referendum. Now we see data compared with 2019 when we actually came out. 2025 UK exports to the EU were 14% down, imports 10% down. So on an economic level, I think it's hard to conclude anything other than very negative.
So you talk about this increased red tape in terms of business link and trade, etc. But I guess when many people were campaigning for leaving the European Union a decade ago, a major reason was exactly the fact that many people were fed up with this red tape within the EU, right?
I think that was one reason. I think the reasons were not made very clear.
Okay.
The Brexiteers, as they were known, those advocating to coming out, fought a very, very powerful campaign, funded very heavily, very passionate. So I think the reasons were to do with red tape. I think it was put to the British people that we would save millions by not contributing to the EU fund base and therefore be able to spend more on the NHS. They had battle buses with millions of pounds a day to the NHS if you vote to leave, etc., and the opportunity to do deals outside of the EU independently. So there were very powerful arguments at the time that became very persuasive. But as you say, most people now regret that vote.
Apart from the economic impact, what do you think are some of the other major impacts on your country?
Well, as I said, Sadiq Khan's probably referring to the social impact. It certainly proved to be socially divisive. The country isn't perhaps as inclusive as it could have been. It certainly seemed to be a vote for exclusion of people from different backgrounds, different ethnic groups, ethnic minorities. Certainly that was the message. And post-Brexit, there were incidents and then the rise of violence in that area was there, most definitely. So socially divisive, particularly in cities like London, very multicultural, and I think that impact is beyond doubt as well. In how we grapple with this and how we reset, as the current outgoing UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer was trying to do, is really the next task.
Actually, in this recent YouGov poll, 2/3 of those who voted for Brexit a decade ago still stand by their original vote today. Many of them actually argue that Brexit was handled poorly by the successive governments and politicians that oversaw that transition, but the move itself should not really be blamed. What is your take on this?
It's interesting to be interested to see where this comes from. I think there's still a lot of British people who I think are a little bit fearful of change, and they fear the EU perhaps sort of taking over when in fact really we're all working together, and the evidence is to the opposite. A lot of it has to do with immigration and the boats and the Stop the Boats campaigning and refugees or migrants coming over from poorer countries, and governments haven't dealt with that, and Brexit was going to give us the powers to do that. But Brexit has given the UK government very little additional power to do that. So I think that view is still largely based on ignorance and fear, unfortunately.
So if we talk about the fact that Britain has had 6 prime ministers over the past 1 decade, to what extent is this political status quo or political picture related to the fallout of the Brexit, in your opinion?
It certainly is related, and it hasn't helped. So we do need clarity. The markets need clarity. The business community needs clarity and stability. So, for example, the latest sort of excitement here at Downing Street on Monday morning was Keir Starmer coming out to resign. He has pledged to a reset with the EU. Now, it's not a complete sort of going back on Brexit and having a second referendum, but certainly moves towards that. His successor, his almost certain successor, Andy Burnham, has made it very clear his stance is quite different. So it's not a reset. Another likely contender who's pulled out West Streeting pledged to almost go through with a second referendum and repeal Brexit. So certainly this hasn't helped at all. And if you look at the prime ministers, their stance on Brexit has differed. So not good at all. And where we're going from here is still not clear either on where Andy Burnham, the likely UK Prime Minister, in perhaps only a matter of weeks, where he stands, remains to be seen. He needs to make that very, very clear where he stands and what he will do.
It looks to me that, for example, when we talk about this comments or suggestions about a reset of the ties with the EU, it looks to me it's really not that different from the scenario when the UK was actually within the EU. What is your perception?
It's not really. It's quite difficult to unpick this. And when the people have voted, when you have a referendum, it really is defining and definitive. So it's difficult to unpick this. I mean, what Keir Starmer was trying to do at a summit that's now being postponed next week is trying to reset policies when it comes to agriculture and farming, where the situation is very, very different now, and basically gradually row back some of the barriers that have been placed as a result of Brexit, industry by industry. But you're right, it's not entirely clear, and many would argue there's a need for a second referendum. And let's see what the people do.
So by the way, Mike, very briefly, the final question. Do you see a day when Britain is going to rejoin the EU?
Yes. I think there will be a second referendum in a matter of years, and I think the majority of the people will vote to return, but it probably won't be on the same basis, probably slightly inferior position. 70% of those under 30 voted to remain in the initial Brexit referendum. That's telling. So yes, we will return.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us and for your own perspective. Dr. Mike Bastian joining us from Britain's University of Southampton. You are listening to World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on our previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. We'll be back after a very short break. You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Australia is serving as the guest country of honor at the China International Supply Chain Expo for the first time this year, highlighting Australia's growing focus on supply chain cooperation with China. Dominic Trindade is the commercial minister with the Australian Embassy in Beijing. Speaking with my colleague Lian Qingxuan, he says Australia is using this expo to showcase the country's strength in agriculture, renewable energy, and smart industries. He says Australia remains a trusted supplier of high-quality agricultural products to China and sees strong potentials regarding deeper cooperation in areas like agricultural technology, clean energy, and AI-driven supply chain management.
Australia is now serving the guest country of honor at China's International Supply Chain Expo for the first time this year. So what strength of Australia's industrial and supply chains are you most willing to showcase to Chinese and global partners?
Yeah. So the first point I'd say is it's right that this year is the first time that Australia is the guest country of honor at the China International Supply Chain Expo. But it's not the first time that Australian businesses have been here in Beijing for this really important expo. In fact, in the previous 3 years, we've had quite a substantial Australian business presence. What's the difference that we are now guest country of honour? I think it is that we have now a national pavilion. We can use that as a place to bring people together. That's one important difference. The second is that this year we decided that we would partner with a key Australian industry peak body. That is the Smart Energy Council. That is a peak body that is part of a trade network that we've established with the Australian Trade and Investment Commission to work with Australian businesses to support them around market development, including to support them in looking at new market, diversification markets, managing risk, building resilience in trade. And so that partnership includes the Smart Energy Council bringing a group of businesses from the renewables sector, which is what they represent, to this expo. And so that's a big focus of the Australian businesses who are here. And we're supporting them in looking for opportunities to engage with Chinese partners, particularly in those sectors. So that includes smart energy, but also extending right through supply chains upstream to smart production in minerals and resources, energy efficient production, smart agriculture. So we have a diverse group of Australian businesses and institutions that are represented here today under the National Pavilion brand.
Yeah, agriculture has long been a cornerstone of China and Australia cooperation, and today our interview will focus on the agriculture. So what role do Australia's agricultural and livestock and seafood industries play in today's global supply chain?
Yeah, so Australia's famous for some of our agricultural commodities, and those have been, hugely important to providing Chinese consumers with reliable sources for clean, healthy, safe food and agricultural commodities. So we all know that Australian producers of grains have supported Chinese production of a range of products. So I learned recently that even in some of the Chinese famous Baijiu brands, they use some sorghum grain from Australia. We have a lot of Australian barley wheat, or barley product, grains, in malted barley form going into China's famous beers like Qingdao beer and the like. And so that's all about how we use technology to improve the quality of our produce, our exports of agriculture. And we look at a lot of things around water usage, how you use technology to monitor the quality of soils and to work on all aspects of production. And so we have businesses who are very, very interested in looking at what China also develops in that sense and how we can work together right through the supply chain from, if you like, the paddock, as we say, to the plate, where our great products are offered to Chinese consumers.
And Chinese consumers are now increasingly seeking high-quality food, as you said. And so what new opportunities does this create for Australia's agricultural supply chain?
Yeah, so we've had a tremendous relationship, a trade relationship built around the reliability, stability, great quality, the healthiness, the cleanliness of our food products. And that's been hard won. We've worked hard to do that through very strong and effective support and regulation of our industries. Chinese consumers know that Australia looks after our industries. They know that Australian producers, our farmers, our fishermen, and they also care for the environment and they care for the produce, and that is reflected in the quality of the products that we export to China. And we'll continue to do that. And so where we can find opportunities to use new technologies, smarter technologies, cleaner fuels to support the production of our industries, better use of renewable energy in those sectors, we'll do that. And we'll partner with Chinese businesses right through the supply chain in order to do that.
The cold chain logistics and warehousing and digital management are now reshaping global agricultural supply chains. So what experience and some expertise can Australia share with China in these areas?
Well, I think it's a matter of expertise being shared in both directions. I mean, there's no question China has developed supply chain technologies, including on the information side, on the technology side, in an incredible level, and they've done it at scale. So there are many things that people from right around the world could look at in China and also see development that benefits in the other direction. Australia's always had a strong science-based research and development, technology development sector, and in previous years there was a lot of engagement between Australia and China around supporting the development of China's soil scientists and those sectors. We had people studying in Australia under scholarship and other programs, partnering with Chinese research institutions to develop those, great technologies, but also things in places like forestry. Some things that haven't been mentioned to the public, they're not famous brands, but they are things that have been worked at in agriculture technology for many, many years. Nowadays, people look at the whole range of technology developments, including how we might use AI. How will AI benefit our industries? How can we work together to get the best from AI for the benefit of our consumers, our workers, our business owners, and our broader societies? And how can we ensure that AI can be optimized for our supply chains to produce those benefits?
The China's International Supply Chain Expo is not only about the flow of goods, but also of industrial collaboration. So what forms of supply chain cooperation between China and Australia hold the greatest potential in agriculture?
Yeah, I think how people will use some of the technology to improve production yields and to look at how to provide food safety and how to ensure that when people buy products, they can do so with confidence, that they know how the product has been produced. They can trace things. Australian businesses are rising up to the challenges of doing that. That's a trend right around the world. And so for agricultural producers in Australia, they are very efficient. I mean, Australian producers are used to dealing with an environment which is a challenging one. Australia's the driest continent in the world. Australian farmers have had to learn how to be efficient, particularly around water usage, but also our soils are some of the oldest and therefore least naturally fertile in the world. So our farmers have to be good at using the limited resources that we have of that kind to be efficient producers. And so there's a place there for more efficient technology, and there is indeed a better use of renewable energy.
That was Dominic Trindade, Commercial Minister with the Australian Embassy here in Beijing, talking with my colleague Lian Qingxuan. This is World Today. We'll be back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. The U.S. Federal Reserve once again left interest rates unchanged earlier this month as the U.S. economy weathers its highest inflation in 3 years. The announcement marked the first decision regarding interest rates since President Donald Trump's nominee Kevin Walsh took the helm of the Federal Reserve chair. Walsh has already voiced a commitment to bringing inflation down to the Fed's desired level of 2%. The annual pace of price increases currently registered at more than twice of that particular target. At the same time, a massive wave of investment into AI or artificial intelligence is becoming a key driver for U.S. growth, raising questions about whether a new wave of bubble is actually forming. So, for more on this and the wider U.S. economy, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, professor of economics with Willamette University.
So, Yan, the Federal Reserve has kept the interest rates unchanged despite the inflation remaining above target. What does this tell us about how policymakers currently assess the U.S. economy?
Well, I think the policymakers are now still in a difficult position because on the one hand, as you mentioned, the inflation rate is definitely above the target. The May CPI has gone up by 4.2%, which is increasing at the fastest pace in 3 years. So that indicates that a rate cut is necessary according to the Fed's playbook. But on the other hand, because the Iran and US peace deal has been made, at least temporarily, that gives the indication that possibly the inflation could be kept under control. So I think the Fed at this point keep the rate steady to look forward to the more market signals and data to support one way or the other. But right now, I think the FOMC is quite split in their opinions to increase the rate cuts or to cut it to keep it steady or to hike the interest rates. According to the dot plot, 9 members voted the interest rate should be kept steady or rate cuts, and then half 9 members believe that the interest rate should be increased. So it's quite a difficult position for the central bankers to be at this point.
And Kevin Walsh's first meeting as Federal Reserve Chairman was widely interpreted as hawkish. So what signal does he send to the markets?
Well, I think the signal to the market is that he wants to keep the interest rate high or at the rate that will help to keep the price stable. In multiple occasions that he mentioned about price stability. And so he talked about the committee should have unambiguous and unanimous resolve to get inflation under control. So the market interpret this as a way that he will take a hawkish stance in order to keep inflation low. And as a market response, after the policy making, even though the rate is kept steady, the policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury yield soared by 14.4 basis points. So again, the markets interpret the stance of the Fed chair as being hawkish.
And markets are now discussing the possibility of a rate hike rather than a rate cut. So is that a realistic scenario for this year?
Well, I think it all depends whether the peace deal is going to hold still and whether or not the inflation number will come down. And again, as I mentioned earlier, based on the dot plot of expectation, there is inclination for a hike later this year. And the FOMC has been split on this decision, so it remains to be seen. The medium dot, however, points to a 0.25 percentage point increase. So that's indication that the FOMC may likely to have an increase in the rate cuts in the later of this year. But again, all of this really depends on whether or not the situation in the Middle East is under control and inflation will remain steady.
And as you mentioned, inflation has been driven partly by energy shocks linked to the Middle East conflict. So how much of the U.S. inflation is due to geopolitical tensions and how much is it a structural problem?
Well, I think it's a matter of both. I think on the one hand, the Strait of Hormuz and the disruption in the global energy supply chain definitely, weigh on the inflation. But on the other hand, I think there are a couple of American domestic issues that also could keep the inflation rate high. So for example, the limited labor supply that could help to keep up the wage high due to the restrictive immigration policies. We already start to see many of the service industries have seen price increase, largely driven by wages and other factors. And there's also AI spending that has been really driving up energy costs for households and has also caused a lot of material shortages and sort of competition, right, for billable power, water, raw materials, industrial supplies, and so on and so forth. So all of this, I think, in a way, is driving inflation up.
And AI-related investment in the U.S. reportedly contributed a significant share of the recent U.S. GDP growth. So is that sustainable, or are we seeing signs of overinvestment?
I think there is always a danger for the AI investment to be excessive, just because looking at the scale of, for example, data center build up. The U.S. is globally actually is expected to have $2.9 trillion worth of global capex on the data center between 2025 and 2028, and the great majority of the spending is in the United States. For the hyperscalers, for example, there's expecting to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build data centers to increase their capex spending on AI. So I think that definitely creates a lot more the kinds of investment escalation. So in other words, when one company is investing, others will jump in because no one wants to lose out in the race. So in that sense, I think it could create some kind of overinvestment. In other words, investment is not really driven by actual needs or the earning supports of the investment, but rather sort of a competition, a race.
And how worried should investors be about the circular financing where companies throughout the AI ecosystem invest in one another?
Well, I think the circular financing, as we mentioned, is basically one AI hyperscaler is investing in others, and then these other AI companies in turn buy their CPUs or rent their cloud service from the investors. So this, on the one hand, will inflate our cash earnings and lead to the overinvestment. On the other hand, it really built up a circular and a very sort of laden kind of liability structures. So when one node goes wrong, the whole liability structure will be unraveled. So I think this is quite concerning. And what is more concerning is that the policymakers, the regulators are basically turning a blind eye to this. So I think that is really what is troublesome, where there's all these, opaque and shadow kinds of financing that's going on, including the circular equity financing. And on the other hand, the regulators are simply ignoring these fragility of financial system buildup.
And the Federal Reserve aims to get the inflation under control, but it is facing some policy dilemma. So could you elaborate more on that? And what do you think pose the bigger challenge to the U.S. economy right now?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, of course, is still this idea of AI investments, because AI right now really accounts for the great majority of the U.S. growth. But if the earning gets disappointed or this investment turns infertile, then this could really unravel the entire scheme. And inflation is definitely one of the other concerns, given the rising, prices, and the Fed is not, taking sufficient actions. And I think that the peace deal right now is still very fragile. And if there's anything worsened on that front, that could again create a lot more, disruptions in the U.S. economy. So overall, I think that the AI-driven economy with this inflation and also with the fragile ceasefire deal, all of this, I think, pose certain danger to the U.S. economy.
And do you think the U.S. economy is also facing the potential risk of stagflation?
I think that is definitely a possibility. Inflation is high and the growth rate has significantly slowed down. It is, again, all hinges on the AI expenditure. If that expenditure is not meeting, the expected cash earnings, that could definitely derail the U.S. economy and create kinds of stagflation scenario.
Yan Liang, professor of economics, joining us from Willamette University, speaking with my colleague Zhao Yang. You are listening to World Today. Stay tuned. You are back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. The World Health Organization says the Democratic Republic of the Congo has reported the largest number of confirmed cases in the first month of any Ebola outbreak. The UN Health Agency says part of the reason for the scale of the outbreak was that some early confirmed cases were located in urban centers. The World Health Organization is calling for scaling up our response, warning that the outbreak is moving faster than our existing response to it. Experts say the Bundibugyo virus strain had already been circulating for months before it was officially declared in the mid of May. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Andrew Easton, Emeritus Professor of Virology, joining us from the University of Warwick in Britain. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor.
Happy to be here.
So, first of all, does the latest statement from the World Health Organization suggest that the final scale for the current Ebola outbreak could ultimately surpass the scale of the last major Ebola crisis between 2014 and 2016?
Well, obviously, the rate of spread and appearance of the infection is a concern. It is extremely rapid. But to put it in context in the terms of the question that you asked, so far there have been around about 1,000 confirmed cases in this outbreak, albeit in a relatively short time frame. In the much longer outbreak in 2014, 2015, the total number of cases was in the region of 23,500. They're about 28,000, I beg your pardon. So a considerable difference. So still not in that territory yet, but it is obviously a concern to the people on the ground that this may spread, particularly because it's in an urban area where we know that the spread is much more rapid.
So, Professor, what are your main takeaways as you observe the current outbreak over the past 1 month or even longer?
Well, over the period of which we've become aware of it, the first point is the one that's already been made, is the speed with which it's spreading. That's something that is unusual and obviously of concern. The other thing that's clear, which is very sad, is that despite our experience in 2014-15 with that vast number of people who were infected, approximately 40% or so died in that outbreak, the international response has been very disappointing. We know the risks that are present with the spread of this virus, and there really is a desperate need to respond quickly to try and stop it, because the longer we leave it before a response is initiated, the more difficult it will be to bring it under control. And so it is a concern that there seems to be a lack of urgency from large parts of the world who would be expected to contribute to helping here.
Now, we know France has just confirmed its first case of Ebola, which involves a doctor who has just returned from a humanitarian mission to the DR Congo. So as you look at this particular case in France or involving France, do you read any additional concern?
No, I don't think so. For a number of reasons. The first is this is obviously somebody who is known to have been in the area where it's a very high risk and to have had contact with infected individuals. So that's someone that would have been monitored anyway. In those situations, it's been shown that any spread of the infection from these individuals is very limited, if at all, and is relatively easy to control, because there will be good contact tracing and testing, which is key to being able to suppress any further spread. And again, to put it in context, during the 2014 and 15 outbreak, there were, of course, infections in other countries by people who've been traveling from the infected area. And in that case, the numbers were actually 36 individuals who traveled to various parts of the world. And in every single case, there was no significant spread of the infection. It was contained very carefully and relatively easily, because we understand that someone coming from these areas is at risk and will be monitored. So I think it's not necessary to be concerned about this. Obviously, there still needs to be steps in place to monitor anyone who's coming from these high risk areas to make sure that they're picked up if there is a problem.
Okay. So what do you think we know about the Bundibugyo strain of the virus so far? For example, can we expect to see any approved vaccine or treatment for this particular strain of Ebola anytime soon?
Yeah, so this is a strain that first appeared in around 2007 in a relatively small outbreak, and then subsequently again in 2012. Firstly in Uganda and secondly in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Yes, the fact that it's a different strain is significant because it means that the current vaccines, the vaccines that were made available for the larger outbreak, will have very limited, if any, efficacy. But there are significant efforts ongoing and have been ongoing for certainly a few weeks now to try and remaster, if you will, the vaccines that were generated previously for the Zaire strain variant that was around then. Obviously, that does take time, but as we have seen, the technologies for modifying and then generating new vaccines have advanced incredibly rapidly. So I would expect a vaccine to be coming available fairly soon. That doesn't mean in days, of course, that will take a bit longer than that. And then there will be a need for them to be given special permission for use in these exceptional circumstances without having to go through the usually extensive testing that we would expect in different times.
Yeah, okay.
So yes, I think there's positive hope and expectation that a vaccine will come along. Just hopefully in the time frame that's going to be useful to maintain it. That, however, does not mean that we can relax the current procedures and processes that are ongoing to try and restrain the spread of this infection.
Very briefly, the final question, Professor, do you think there is still room for the existing response in Central Africa to further scale up?
Absolutely. Not only is there further room for it, there's a necessity for it. It really has to be stepped up. Obviously, that has to be managed carefully because of the nature of the area where the infection is present. It's a conflict area that brings difficulties of its own, and also there are the local sensitivities of the people in the area who are being affected by this. But there is definitely a very strong need for more help and assistance and intervention, and it's very disappointing that there has been this very slow response given, as I said already, the experience we had just 10 years or so ago where it was a devastating consequence there.
Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Andrew Easton joining us from the University of Warwick in Britain. Unfortunately, that's all the time for this edition of World Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on our previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Bye for now.